Oregon Territory, spring of 1869. A ramshackle settlement sat at the edge of the woods, half swallowed by dust and pine shadows. Wagons creaked along the road, and the scent of pitch, sweat, and smoke floated through the air like a warning. Outside, the trading post, someone had thrown together an auction platform, nothing but wagon planks balanced on stacked crates. Men gathered around it, boots scraping gravel, shoulders hunched, breaths heavy with tobacco and boredom. Their faces were wind-scarred, their clothes stiff with dirt and labor, and their eyes carried a streak of hunger, something wild that came from too many lonely nights. Most of them weren't there for a bargain. They came to watch, sneer, and prove they were still above something in this God-forsaken place. A deputy with a rusted badge and coat, faded beyond recognition, slammed a wooden gavel against the post. "Last one," he barked, voice frayed from whiskey and shouting. "No name, no history, and no complaint. Says she can work, says she obey." He gestured to a woman on the platform, bare feet planted in the dirt, hands bound with rough twine, and over her head a sack, stiff with travel grime, tied tight beneath the chin. She stood perfectly still, shoulders tense, like a deer waiting for the shot. "Starting bid," the deputy boomed. $2. Who wants themselves a wife they can't look at? Laughter scattered through the crowd, sharp and ugly. "Maybe the sack's the better part," someone hollered. "Could be a ghost under there." Another joked. "Hell, marry the bag and leave whatever's inside be." A third said. Some turned their backs, spitting into the dirt, saying they'd seen enough madness on this trail already. Others stayed, elbows nudging each other, waiting to see which fool would put his money on someone who wouldn't even show her face. The woman didn't move. Not a step, not a plea. Her breath strained against the burlap, shallow and rigid. The twine around her wrists tightened when her fingers started to tremble, then clenched as though she forced them still. The deputy huffed. "Won't even speak," he muttered. $2, last call. Someone try their luck, or we haul her to the sheriff and let him decide if she's scrap. Silence stretched so long the wind felt loud dot, then the men parted, slow and uncertain. A figure moved through them, neither hurried nor hesitant. His coat was coarse canvas, shoulders broad from labor, his boots muddied from weeks in the timber camps. A black hat shaded his face, streaked with sawdust that clung like snow. One hand rested on an axe handle wrapped in cracked leather, worn the way only a working man's tool could be. He stopped at the front. $2, he said. The deputy blinked. "You ain't want to see what you're buying?" The man didn't bother looking up at him. His gaze stayed fixed on the woman, sack and all. "I'm not buying a face," he said quietly, as though stating a fact, not an opinion. "I'm marrying a person." No one laughed this time. A few boots shifted on the dusty ground. The deputy swallowed hard and wiped sweat from his brow. "Name?" he croaked. "Silas Boone," the man answered. "Timber worker, North Ridge." The contract was scratched out on brittle paper. Silas signed with a steady stroke, as if he were simply signing off for lumber delivery. Then the deputy turned toward the woman. "You're now bound in lawful marriage, miss. State your name." The sack twitched slightly. The crowd leaned forward, as though sound itself had to be hunted. At first nothing came, then a whisper, faint as a spark in winter. "Annabelle Crow." Silas froze. Something in his face flickered, brief as a lightning flash recognition, disbelief, something old. He stared at the sack as though it had suddenly become a doorway to another life. The deputy shrugged. "That's that," he muttered. "Paid and sealed." Silas stepped closer to her. He didn't tug, didn't push. He simply lifted her bound wrist, steady as a pine trunk, and helped her down from the platform. His hold wasn't gentle enough to be affectionate, nor firm enough to be controlling. It said one thing clearly: "You're leaving here upright, no." One called after them. No one spat or joked. Not a soul dared break whatever had passed between the name and the man who paid for it. They walked past the outpost, past the horses, into the woods where the air grew colder under the trees. The sound of the crowd faded, swallowed by branches whispering overhead. Her sack tilted once in the wind, and she clutched it tight, keeping her face hidden. Silas said nothing. He only led the mule carrying their supplies, eyes lifting now and again toward the trees, listening not for danger, but for memory. And she followed, no longer being dragged or displayed, but walking because she chose to keep up. The forest closed behind them like a curtain, and whatever story they carried into those trees was theirs alone to unfold. The path to Silas Boone's homestead narrowed as the forest thickened around them. Pines leaned close overhead like eavesdropping giants, and the last glow of daylight filtered through branches and streaks of honey and slate. The sack over Annabel, Crow's head lifted with each breeze, only to be held down again by her bound hands. She never once tried to remove it. She walked as if she knew the price of being seen. Silas kept several steps ahead, the mule plodding behind him with a squeaking saddle pack. He didn't speak, didn't look back, but the rhythm of his steps was slow enough to make room for her. Pace. His silence wasn't cold, only certain, as though he had learned the hard way that words weren't always worth the breath. The cabin came into view just as dusk settled into the soil. Built from thick pine logs, the structure hugged a rise of earth, half protected by the ridge behind it. A chimney leaned slightly left, stone-patched and darkened by years of use. A stack of cut firewood sat neatly beside the door, each log split to near-perfect symmetry. On the doorframe, a horseshoe hung upside down, rusted but carefully placed. Silas opened the door with a muted creak and stepped aside. "You pick where you stand," he said. His voice was low, unpressured. "Nobody. Here's gonna set you in place." Annabel entered without hesitation, yet every movement carried a cautious edge. She stayed close to the wall, her socked feet barely whispering across the wood floor. She didn't gravitate toward the table or the chair. Instead, she crouched down against the far wall, the position of someone who'd learned the safest place. In a room was where no one could get behind you. Silas set down his gear, unwrapped kindling from the mule pack, and moved to the stove. He didn't try to speak to her, didn't ask for anything. The scrape of iron pans, the slow boil of water, the bite of smoke in the air became the only language shared between them. Over time, the room began to smell of meat fat and spice, something with a hint of cinnamon and smoke. The scent seeped into the cabin like warmth that didn't ask for permission. Annabel didn't move even when Silas placed a wooden bowl on the floor near her knees. She flinched, slight as a flicker, but not from the food, rather from the touch of kindness that didn't demand a toll. Silas sat at the table with his own bowl. He didn't look at her, didn't pretend not to. He just ate, slow and steady. Minutes passed before she spoke, muffled through burlap. "What is it?" she asked, tone brittle with caution. Silas stirred the stew once with his spoon. "Something I made for myself when I had nothing but cold nights and aching hands," he said. "A meal for the last one standing." Her breath caught once, as though the phrase struck something in her. A quiet puff of air escaped almost like a laugh, almost like a memory stirring. She pulled the bowl toward her, lifted it beneath the sack, and ate without showing her face. Every bite was measured, like someone who knew hunger but didn't trust full meals to last when she finished. She placed the bowl exactly where he'd left it, as if not disturbing its place was as important as eating it. Silas washed both bowls in a tin basin near the stove. The sound of water swishing against metal filled the cabin. Annabelle remained at the wall, but something in her posture had changed. Her arms weren't clutched tight around her knees. She rested them loosely, as though the fear inside her had stopped shaking long enough to breathe. When the cabin dimmed to embers and the lantern remained unlit, Silas took to the chair near the hearth. He stared into the fire, the light outlining his jaw, his shoulders, his worn shirt. His eyes didn't reflect the flames. They reflected memory, something far colder. He didn't speak at first. The fire cracked, pine sap hissing softly. Then his voice came, not for her, but into the room, the way one might speak to the dark, to keep it from swallowing him whole. 3 winters ago, he said, I should have died in the snow. Annabelle didn't react, though a slight shift of fabric showed she was listening. I got caught too far north, greedy for good timber. Snow hit hard. Leg twisted under me, couldn't move. The flames popped, spitting sparks. Someone found me, dragged me out. I woke in a cave. She kept the fire going, wrapped my leg, fed me something bitter enough to feel like I was chewing bark. The words seemed pulled from him, not offered. I never saw her face, he said. She wore a sack, same as you. Annabelle didn't speak, didn't move, but her breathing shifted deeper, slower. When the sun came up, he continued, she was gone. Only thing she left behind was a scrap of cloth, purple flowers stitched in it. Not pretty, not neat, but careful. Silas leaned back, rubbed the fabric of his coat where an unseen pocket lay. His voice grew quieter. I kept it, still do. Silence settled heavy and warm. He didn't turn to look at her, and she didn't ask anything more. But something invisible bridged the room, something not spoken, not demanded. 2 people awake. In the night, both alive, because of a stranger no one else would ever believe Dot. And in the hush of that cabin, they both knew. Neither one of them had been saved by chance. Morning arrived slowly, creeping through the trees in pale sheets of gold. Mist drifted above the ground like breath waiting to thaw. Silas and Annabelle had not spoken much at dawn. Neither seemed to need to. Silence had become a language, and they knew how to hear it. Annabelle stepped outside first. She walked past the woodpile, past the mule grazing on wet grass, until she reached the tall pine that towered at the edge of the clearing. She sat near its roots, arms folded loosely around her middle. The sack remained over her head, but her posture had shifted, no longer braced, no longer shrinking. The forest air brushed gently against the burlap, as if asking permission. She lifted her hands slowly, hesitantly, and loosened the knot at her neck. The sack rose just enough to reveal her mouth to the wind. She let the cold kiss her skin. It wasn't rebellion. It was relief. A small, cautious opening of a door, long closed. Silas stood nearby, oiling his saw blade. He worked carefully, wiping each tooth with oil and cloth, clearing sap from between the metal ridges. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He simply let the words wander into the quiet, like a man setting a lantern down beside someone. In the dark, I told you yesterday, he said. A woman saved me once. Annabelle didn't turn her head, but the sack lifted slightly, as if her breath had changed. She wore a covering just like yours, Silas continued, gently dragging cloth down the blade's edge. Didn't want anyone to know who she was. Seemed like she felt safer behind it. The wind caught the edge of Annabelle's sack, shifting it just enough for her to raise a hand and tug it lower again. Silas paused. I never forgot her voice, he said. This time, she stilled. He turned his head slightly, not facing her, just letting his words reach her more fully. And your voice sounds the same. A beat of stillness passed. Then a faint sound like fabric sliding over skin. Silas didn't look up, didn't force his attention on her. Only when he felt something shift in the air did he raise his eyes. Annabelle was staring at him. The sack lay folded in her lap. Her face was uncovered. She was not monstrous, nor grotesque. She was simply human, except for the mark that cut across her cheek. A curved scar started near her temple and ended just above her jaw, like someone had dragged a blade along a line meant to erase her. The skin around it puckered slightly. Pale against the sun, she met his gaze without apology, without defense. She held it for what felt like a long time. When she spoke, her voice wasn't trembling. It was controlled, steady, and worn down by truth. The man who owned the boarding house where I worked. She began. Her jaw tightened. He told me I could keep a room if I gave him more than cleaning and cooking. Silas's hands stilled, cloth hanging loose between his fingers. I said no, Annabelle continued. He tried to take what he wanted anyway. I fought him. He slipped. His head struck the stove, and she hesitated, but only to catch her breath. He died. Silas didn't look away, didn't recoil. His jaw flexed once, a reaction he didn't bother to hide. They said I lured him, Annabelle went on. Said I killed him on purpose. No one believed me. There were no witnesses. And a woman with a scar, she looked down at her hands, is already guilty in their eyes. She didn't cry. Her eyes were bright but dry, sharpened by memory instead of broken by it. They covered my face after that, she whispered. Made it easier to sell me off like something ruined. She looked at the sack in her lap. I wore it to stop people from seeing the scar and deciding what I was worth before I even spoke. Silas stood slowly, wiping the saw blade with a final stroke. He didn't step closer. He didn't try to comfort her with touch or pity. He simply said, voice rough but unwavering, "Thank you for telling me." Annabelle blinked, startled by the simplicity. He didn't say she was innocent, didn't say he believed her. He said only what mattered. He had listened, and listening was a kind of promise. The air between them changed, not softened, not warmed, but settled into something clearer. The wind brushed past them, and the forest seemed to exhale. For the first time since she arrived, Annabelle was not hiding. She was not an object. She was not a rumor shrouded in burlap. She was a woman with a name, a story, and a face. And Silas Boone had turned away from none of it. The days that followed her confession passed with a strange kind of quiet. Not fearful, not fragile simply. Steady. Annabelle no longer kept the sack within reach, no longer folded it on her cot like a shield waiting to be grabbed. She rose in the mornings with her hair loose, her scar catching small slants of sunlight as she stood at the table to drink coffee or chop vegetables. She moved through the cabin with the same caution as before, but now with her face uncovered, her steps had a new weight, like she had chosen to exist rather than merely survive. Silas didn't crowd her with questions. He didn't prod her past or offer sympathy she didn't ask for. He simply worked splitting wood, repairing the cabin's roof-lined shingles, mending a broken hinge on the window shutter. And each evening he cooked 2 bowls of stew instead of 1. The cabin walls seemed to hum with a quiet understanding. Neither spoke out loud, but peace in the woods never stayed unchallenged. Trouble came on a gray afternoon, riding beneath skies smeared with storm colors. A stranger arrived at North Reach, a man lean as whittled bone, with a long coat ripped by travel and eyes like cold iron. He called himself Cutter, and though he claimed to be a drifter looking for logging work, the way he looked at people said otherwise. He studied faces not like a man seeking company, but like a hunter memorizing prey. He lounged at the post in town, asked casual questions, tucked them into his coat like sharp tools. He spoke politely, but there was tension in his words, something coiled beneath them. He listened too closely to gossip, lingered too long when someone mentioned a scarred woman seen near Silas Boone's land. Rumors from the southern trails had drifted up rumors of a runaway accused of murder. A woman whose face had once been hidden beneath a sack. Silas met Cutter by chance near the supply shed. Cutter asked where a man could find work cutting timber. Silas answered with measured calm. But what struck him wasn't the stranger's voice. It was the way Cutter's gaze slid past him to the tree line, as if he expected something, or someone to break through. That night, when Silas returned home, his jaw was set tight. He shut the cabin door with a heavy hand. Annabelle looked up from the stove, ladle midder. She knew something had shifted. "He's hunting you," Silas said simply. No alarm, no panic, just truth. Annabelle didn't gasp or cry out. She only sat, the ladle down, and stood still. Then she walked to the wooden chest at the base of her cot. She opened it, reached inside, and pulled out the sack she had recently abandoned. She ran her fingers across the fabric, tracing the frayed edges like an old scar. "I will wear it again," she murmured. Silas shook his head. "You don't have to go back to hiding." Her eyes lifted slowly to meet his. The fear was still there, but something else stood beside it. Resolve. "This time I choose it," she said. "Not to disappear, to survive." They planned through the night at the table, maps spread, voices low. Annabelle would ride out alone through the old fire road at dawn, wearing the sack so Cutter would follow. Silas would take the mountain pass to town, meet the sheriff, and trap Cutter between them. They discussed routes, timing, and signals. They spoke not as strangers, not even as new spouses, but as two people fighting for the same life. Before sunrise, Annabelle mounted Silas's second horse. The sack was tight over her head. The woods were still waiting. Silas handed her the reins with a firmness that held something deeper than caution. She nodded once, the only farewell either of them needed. She rode east, her posture strong and upright, not hunched or trembling. She didn't look back at Silas. She didn't need to. Fear no longer puppeted her. She was leading it. By sundown, Cutter had taken the bait exactly as they expected. He stalked her through the dead trees along the fire road, following the lone, veiled rider deeper into the rocks and into Silas's carefully built trap. Silas and the sheriff waited with 2 men from Ridge Patrol. Cutter drew first, but he wasn't fast enough. He was disarmed, bound, and strapped over his own horse, charged with unlawful pursuit and attempted harm. Annabelle watched from the hilltop, still covered, still. Only after Cutter was hauled away did she ride down toward Silas. He stepped forward to help her dismount. This time she let him. She reached up, fingers steady, and loosened the knot beneath her chin. The sack slid off her head. Once, twice folded. She didn't drop it. She cradled it with both hands, not as a burden, but almost as a tool. It saved me one last time, she said. Not because it hid me, but because I used it. Silas looked at her, eyes soft with respect. "What will you do with it now?" Annabelle studied the trees, the trail, the world that had once hunted her. Then she folded the sack again, tucking it under her arm. "I will keep it," she said, "not as a prison, but as proof." "And proof of what?" Silas asked. She smiled, small and sure, that even what once broke me can belong to me if I choose it to. Cutter's arrest didn't bring silence, not immediately. The law didn't turn on the gallop of a horse or the weight of shackles. Papers had to be signed, charges had to be listed, and stories had to be heard. Annabelle knew that. She also knew that sometimes the truth needed louder voices than the one who lived it. The cabin felt different that evening. Not unsafe, just unsettled, as if the walls hadn't yet learned whether danger was gone or simply circling elsewhere. Annabelle stood at the table, rubbing her thumb across the folded sack in her lap. She seemed undecided whether to tuck it away or keep it near. Silas chopped kindling by the door, the sound sharp and methodical dot. No one spoke much, but the air crackled with unsaid questions. What comes next? Will the truth hold? Will the law listen? By morning, the answer arrived with a quiet knock. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't demanding. It was cautious 3 faint taps, then stillness. Silas opened the door. A woman stood on the porch, boots dusted red from travel, dress faded at the seams, a worn hat clutched between her hands. Her skin was dark, her expression steady, and her eyes held a shadow that looked like guilt grown heavy from carrying itself too long. "Name's Mavis," she said, voice thick with nerves she didn't try to hide. "Mavis Green. I worked at the Ridley house. Kitchen help. Cook mostly." Behind Silas, Annabelle stepped into view. At the sight of her, Mavis flinched, taking a step back before catching herself. "I heard you were up this way," she said, softer now, almost apologizing to the wind. "Figured it was time I stopped being a coward." The world grew still. Not tense, expectant. Mavis swallowed once, twice, then looked directly at Annabelle. "I saw what happened," she said. "Saw him drag you into that back room. Heard you scream. Heard the stove crack when he fell." Annabelle's fingers tightened around the doorframe. Silence weighed heavy, but no denial came. "I didn't speak up," Mavis continued. "Not then. I needed a job. I needed food. I thought if I kept quiet, I'd be safe." Shame rode her words like a weight, but she didn't drop her gaze. "I'm not proud, but I can make it right now, if you'll let me." Annabelle didn't move for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway, silently inviting her in. Inside, they sat at the table over tea, steam curling around the yarn. "Truth." Mavis spoke slowly, carefully, giving details only someone who had truly been there could know. What the floor looked like, where the stove was, how the head housekeeper locked the front door that night, how the owner had a habit of cornering the women who worked alone. "You weren't trying to kill him," she said firmly. "You were trying to get free." Annabelle stared at the cup between her hands, steam fogging her lashes. She didn't cry. Not yet. All she did was breathe deep and steady, as if pulling back air she'd been denied for too long. With Silas guiding them, they wrote down every detail Mavis remembered. Her words poured into ink, shaping truth into something the courts could not ignore. When the paper was ready, Mavis signed her name in slow, careful strokes each. Letter a small act of justice, belated but real. The affidavit was sealed and sent by courier on horseback. Then there was nothing to do but wait. Days passed. Weeks ripened. The forest changed around them. Snow melted into soft ground. Green licked the edges of the trail. Birds returned, old enough to perch on the windowsill. Annabelle and Silas worked as though routine itself might steady them, splitting logs, mending fences, scraping old paint from the shutters. Annabelle didn't touch the sack much. It remained on a shelf near her cot, folded neatly, not hidden, not worn, just present. Until one morning, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. The sheriff rode up with a single envelope, stamped and sealed. No speeches, no warnings, just a letter held out with a nod. Silas opened it on the porch. His eyes scanned the page once, then again. Something in his shoulders eased, not relief, not victory, something calmer, deeper. He handed it to Annabelle. She read the words silently. Charges dropped. Case closed. Warrant rescinded. She didn't gasp or weep. She didn't cling to anyone. She walked past Silas, past the sheriff, past the horses tied near the shed. She strode down to the tree line and sat at the base of the old pine. She pressed her fingers into the moss and closed her eyes, feeling the earth beneath her palms. When she spoke, no louder than a breath, the woods swallowed her words like a prayer offered to soil. For the first time in my life, I don't have to run. She didn't smile. She didn't break. She simply existed free, unchased, seeing Dot, and that quiet, steady peace was more powerful than any shout from a courtroom ever could be. Spring thawed the ridge slowly, as though the earth weren't fully convinced it was safe to soften. Buds swelled on the branches. The river, once choked with ice, began to murmur over stones. The world seemed to move forward in small steps, cautious, like someone who had been hurt before and needed time to trust again. Inside Silas's cabin, life did the same. Annabelle no longer rose in the shadows. She didn't shrink from morning light or conceal herself when the door opened. She washed her face at the basin each day, tied her hair back loosely, and moved through the rooms like someone learning the shape of her own life. She still kept careful distance, still sat with her back to a wall when she read near the hearth, still flinched when a boot scraped too sharply against wood, but her fear didn't command her anymore. It sat beside her like a memory, no longer a master. Silas, for his part, didn't rush anything. He worked outside repairing fence lines, cutting timber, re-thatching the small roof over the woodpile. Some mornings he returned with sap on his sleeves and moss on his boots, asking only, "Coffee still warm?" Some evenings he sat at the table, carving a new handle for his hatchet, while Annabelle mended a torn shirt or stirred a pot of stew. They spoke little, but their silence no longer felt like walls. It felt like two people choosing not to break what didn't need fixing. One morning, Annabelle woke to find something set beside her cup on the table. Not food, not tools. Something unexpected. A mirror. Dot. It stood upright, propped delicately on a block of polished pine. The frame was metal, tarnished at the edges, but cleaned with care. Beside it lay a folded scarf, sea green silk, faded slightly, but soft enough to glide like water. There were no words, no explanations. Silas had already gone out to split timber. Annabelle stared at the scarf for a long time, not touching it, not rejecting it. Eventually, she lifted the mirror and turned it toward the morning light. She looked into it. Not quickly, not as if bracing for something cruel, but as though she were studying someone she had not been introduced to in years. Her scar was visible in the clear glass, not softened by shadow, not blurred by distance. The curved mark along her cheek looked different. In stillness. Less like shame, more like history. Her hand rose to it, fingers brushing lightly along the ridge. Then she turned to the scarf. She held it by both ends, feeling the threads slip through her fingers. It wasn't heavy like the sackcloth. It didn't scratch or hide. It shaped. It softened. She placed it over her hair, not to conceal the scar, but to frame it like choosing the border on a portrait. When she tied it loosely beneath her chin, she didn't look smaller. She looked chosen. Behind her came the soft creak of boots. Silas stood in the doorway, pausing as if afraid to disturb something fragile. "That belonged to my wife," he said, voice respectful, not mournful. "She wore it on days when she needed reminding of herself." Annabelle adjusted the scarf gently at her temple. "I thought it might suit you too," he added. She didn't bow her head, didn't turn away. She looked directly at him, face uncovered, scar visible, confidence settling like a new layer of skin. Silas held her gaze without flinching. Then, quietly, he said, "Anyone who tries to make you ashamed of what you lived through is blind." A beat passed, and another. "And the blind don't get to judge beauty," he finished. Annabelle swallowed, her throat tight. Tears came not sudden or jagged, but warm, slow, deliberate, like something returning to her after being gone too long. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall. She turned again toward the mirror, lifted her hand, and pressed her palm against the glass meeting her reflection, not hiding from it, not denying what she'd survived, not apologizing for who she'd become. The scarf was. No disguise. The scar was no shame dot. She was no longer a ghost taught to vanish. She was a woman who had lived, endured, and chosen to stay visible. And within that small cabin, beneath a quiet roof stitched together from pine and patience, something shifted, something more binding than law, louder than rumor, stronger than fear. Annabel Crow let herself be seen. Spring deepened into color. The ridge, once gray with cold, began wearing green like a renewed vow. Wildflowers crept out of the soil, shy at first, then bold, claiming patches of grass along the clearing. The air smelled warmer. Birds chattered. From the eaves of the cabin, like gossipers, who finally had something worth whispering about. Silas Boone had been busy dot with quiet persistence and a carpenter's patience. He built a small canopy just outside the cabin near the edge of the woods. 4 upright beams, a simple arch, linen draped across the top, washing gently in the wind. No decoration, except what the forest gave, pine needles brushing the edges, sunlight slipping through branches to rest on the canvas like blessings dot. It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to impress. It stood the way Silas did, simple, strong, with nothing to prove beyond its purpose. They invited only a few. Mavis returned from town in a dress that didn't match her boots, smiling like someone who'd finally set down a heavy load. The old blacksmith brought a bottle of apple brandy wrapped in cloth. The shopkeeper's wife carried a basket of bread and a spray of mountain lavender tied with twine. They weren't many, but they were enough. Enough to bear witness. Enough to hear vows spoken into open air instead of fear. Inside the cabin, Annabel stood before the mirror Silas had given her. Her dress was handmade, sewn from muslin, cream-colored and clean. The stitches weren't perfect, some lines curved, where they should have been straight, but they were hers, sewn slowly at night by the glow of the fire. It fit her not because it was flawless, but because she had shaped it with her own hands. What lay on her head made the dress seem secondary. Her veil dot, it was cut from the sackcloth, the same burlap that had once turned her into something nameless, faceless, sold like a bundle. Silas had washed it, dried it in sunlight, cut it with care. Along the edges, tiny white stitches mended what had once been torn, and at its corners, faint purple flowers had been embroidered, crooked but tender, almost identical to the small, embroidered cloth she had once left behind in a cave, believing no one would ever remember her. Annabel didn't hide her scar beneath the veil. It showed through faintly, as if the past could witness the present without swallowing it. She adjusted the scarf underneath, letting silk meet burlap, softness holding strength, beauty resting beside what once had been shame. Outside, Silas waited. Beneath the arch, he had trimmed his beard, cleaned his boots with pine oil, and ironed the only shirt he owned that wasn't streaked with sap. The shirt still had a faint stain near the cuff and a small tear near the seam, but he wore it like a man wears his history, not perfect, but honest dot. When Annabel stepped from the cabin, the forest quieted. The wind slowed. The light softened. She moved forward, not like someone who had been rescued, but like someone who had chosen where her feet would go. Silas met her in the center of the clearing. His voice was steady as he took her hands. "No matter what covered your face," he said, "you were always the woman I chose." He paused, letting the truth settle, letting each word find her without force. "And now you are the woman I vow to stand beside. Not because you need protection, but because you choose to stand with me. Annabel didn't bow her head or shy away. She looked at him fully, openly, and the smile that touched her lips was not small. It was quiet, but wide, like something long buried had finally risen. "I vow the same," she whispered. There was no preacher, no church, no book of vows held between them. Just two people, the trees, a few witnesses, and the wind. And when they kissed, it was soft, certain, and brief enough to feel like a promise, not a performance. A few raindrops fell, light as dust. Mavis leaned toward the blacksmith and whispered, grinning, "Never thought I'd see a burlap sack turned into a wedding veil." The blacksmith chuckled. "Ain't the sack," he said. "It's what she made it into." Later, as dusk settled and laughter mingled with birdsong, Annabel sat beside Silas on the porch. The veil lay folded in her lap, its stitched edges resting gently against her palm. "Funny," she murmured, rubbing her thumb along the cloth. "This used to mean everything I feared." Silas looked over. "And now?" She let out a soft breath. "Now it means everything I chose." He nodded, lacing his fingers with hers. They stayed like that until stars gathered overhead, the forest no longer a hiding place, but a home. And beneath those pines, where a veil once meant silence and now meant strength, Annabel Crow and Silas Boone carved a life not out of erasing their past, but out of reclaiming it, together. Even in the quietest corners of the frontier, life had a way of shifting. Summer bled into cooler winds. Branches that once reached with young green now deepened toward brown. The air carried fewer birdsong mornings and more evenings where the forest hummed like an old friend settling beside a fire. Silas and Annabel learned to live in rhythm with it. The cabin grew busier. Silas tracked down better tools and stacked timber with more intention. Annabel organized shelves, lined jars. With herbs she dried, patched clothing for both of them, and made a simple quilt that held heat even on the coldest nights. Their home wasn't perfect. It leaned a little at the corners, and the window rattled when wind came down the ridge, but it was lived in, stitched together with work and choice, not desperation. Word traveled through the valley about Cutter's capture and Annabel's cleared name. Even the men in town, who once smirked at gossip and whispered behind whiskey glasses, nodded at Silas when he came in for supplies. The sheriff tipped his hat to Annabel when he passed their land, a silent, overdue respect. Nobody called her a ghost or a killer or a shame to look at. They called her by her name and said it plain, Annabel Crow. She still wore the scarf sometimes. Not every day, just when she wanted to feel its silk slip against her hair, when she needed a reminder that things once used to hide her could now belong to her. The veil, newly cut and stitched, waited in a small oak box on the dresser. She didn't keep it there to forget it. She kept it so she could choose to remember. Sometimes, at dusk, she traced her scar, not to check if it was hidden, but to feel the truth of where she'd been. No one hurried her past it. No one told her to bury it. Silas never once asked her to smile or pretend or soften the hardness of what she endured. He simply asked her what she wanted for supper, or whether she preferred spruce or oak for firewood, or whether she wanted the quilt thicker before the cold came in. They built there. Life on small questions, not demands. On quiet, not erasure. On presence, not possession. One cold morning, as frost clung to the windows, Annabel stepped outside to find Silas repairing the fence line. She walked to the pine tree she'd sat beneath the day her freedom had arrived. Moss covered its roots, in thick, soft patches. She knelt and pushed her fingers into it slow, steady, like greeting an old companion. The earth smelled clean. Silas glanced over, wiping the frost from his beard, and came to stand beside her. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He waited. Annabel brushed her palm across the base of the tree. "I buried shame here once," she said quietly. Not the kind they blamed me for. The kind I carried on my own. Silas crouched, resting, his forearm along his knee. And what now? She looked up at him, eyes reflecting the pale winter sun. Now I planned something else. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out seeds, wildflower seeds, gathered from the hill where she and Silas had married. She pressed them into the soil with careful fingers. Things don't need to grow perfect, she said, smoothing the dirt over them. Just honest, Silas smiled, slow and proud. Then we'll tend them. They stood together, watching the seeds disappear beneath the earth. Not buried, sown. Weeks passed, bringing colder nights and earlier sunsets. They chopped wood, patched. Leaks sealed windows against winter. And one evening, as the first snowfall dusted the ridge, they sat beside the hearth, sharing stew thicker than any Silas had ever made for himself in solitude. Annabel fed the fire when it hissed low, and Silas handed her the ladle when the stew needed stirring. Nothing grand, nothing performed, just two lives turning toward each other. Later, as flames dimmed to embers and the cabin breathed with warmth, Annabel rested her head against Silas's shoulder, her cheek scar and all visible in the wavering light. He laid his hand over hers, and they held still, quiet not because they'd run out of words, but because they had finally found peace that didn't require them. Their story didn't erase pain or rewrite what had been broken. It didn't pretend the wilderness was gentle or that life on the trail was fair. It simply took what had once been used to imprison Annabel, her silence, her hidden face, her shame, and turned it into something chosen. And sometimes survival isn't just holding on, it's deciding what to hold on to, under pines tall enough to witness years instead of days. Annabel Crow and Silas Boone made a home out of choice, out of truth, out of the quiet kind of love that doesn't rescue or demand, but stands beside. Where fear once chased her, life now welcomed her. Where a sack once covered her, she wove veils. Where shame once buried her, she planted flowers, and in that wilderness, stitched by wind and wood and long-earned peace, they lived, not hidden, not hunted, but seen.